take just a few minutes to let people get into the room, and then we will kick it off. So thanks for joining us. Right, so it looks like people are still coming in. We're going to give you just about one more minute, and then we will kick it off. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Well, hello, everyone. We're officially at 12:02, so we're going to kick things off here. My name is Robert P. Jones. I am the president and founder at PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. And we're here today to talk about the exciting new release of a major survey project that we've been working on over the past year. It is the largest study ever conducted on support for Christian nationalism in the country. It gets measures of Christian nationalism across all 50 states. And we have here a distinguished group of panelists to talk about the results today. The way we'll do this is I will first lay out the findings with some PowerPoint slides that give you the highlights, and then I will turn it over to each of our panelists, who will each have 5 to 7 minutes to talk about what they see in the study, and then we will have a little discussion among us. We will likely not have a formal Q&A session at the end, but if you have questions you want to put in the Q&A part, that is open today, and we can use that to kind of help structure our discussion at the end of our time together today. So I'll say a little bit more about what the survey is once I get into the presentation, but let me just talk a little bit about who we have with us today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Katherine Stewart, Jemar Tisby, and Andrew Whitehead. So let me give you a little bit about each of them. So Katherine Stewart is a journalist and award-winning author. Her latest book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, was awarded first place for excellence in the nonfiction books category by the Religion News Association, as well as a Morris D. Forkosh Award. She writes for the New York Times Opinion, the New Republic, and others. And most recently, you may have seen The Power Worshippers was adapted into a documentary film feature, God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner. She also has a forthcoming book that will be published by Bloomsbury in January 2025. So, Katherine, thanks for being with us today. Next, we have Jamar Tisby. Jamar is the professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky. He has also written multiple books on race and religion, including the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise: The Truth About America's Churches, about the American Church's Complicity in Racism. He also has a new book coming out this fall, The Spirit of Justice: Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. So, Jamar, thanks for being with us. And finally, last but not least, we have Andrew Whitehead, who is an associate professor of sociology and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at Indiana University, Indianapolis. He's also the author of 2 books on Christian nationalism, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, and Taking America Back for God. So Andrew, thanks for being with us today. So my job, I think, is to set the table for the conversation today, and to spend about 20 minutes going through the major findings that we have from this survey, and then we will go in that order that I just introduced everyone in and hear commentary from them. So without further ado, why don't we just jump in here? All right. All right, so what are we talking about today? So we at PRRI a year ago did a survey with in partnership with the Brookings Institution to measure Christian nationalism at the national level. And across the last year, we spent really the entire year carrying those measures over so that we could get a very large sample size to map the support for Christian nationalism in all 50 states. So the current survey was conducted between March and December of last year. It is a survey of over 22,000 adults in the country. The margin of error for the full sample is actually less than 1 percentage point here. And so it allows us to, again, get down to all 50 states and to look at not just national, not just regional, but state level data. So first of all, what are we measuring here? And it's important for quantitative analysis to be very specific about what we're measuring. We built on the work of a number of political scientists and sociologists, including Andrew Whitehead, his colleague Sam Perry, Paul Jupe, Phil Gorski, and others, to develop these 5 questions that we are measuring Christian nationalism with. Here they are. So you can see, I won't read all of them, but basically you get the idea, this idea, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation, or U.S. law should be based on Christian values. And so we basically combined all of these into a composite measure so that we could get a sense of who agreed with all of these statements, who agreed with most of these statements, who disagreed with most of them, and who disagreed with all of them. And we came up with these categories to classify people in those groups. Adherents are those who essentially completely agreed with nearly all of those questions. Sympathizers are those who agreed, but not completely agreed with those statements. Skeptics are those who disagreed, but maybe didn't completely disagree. And rejectors are those who completely disagreed with all 5 of those statements. So we put those together into a composite measure. And we essentially found these 4 groups. The first 2 I'll talk about because we're going to talk about them together. They are different in terms of intensity, but they do lean the same direction into being at least sympathetic toward Christian nationalism. The first are adherents. They make up about 1 in 10 Americans, and then an additional 20% of what we are calling Christian nationalism sympathizers make up about 1 in 5 Americans. So together, that's about 3 in 10 Americans who lean towards supporting Christian nationalism in the country today. And then here are the other categories. You can see it's about 4 in 10 Americans who are skeptics, who mostly disagree with those statements, and then about 3 in 10 Americans who reject all of those statements. So overall, it's about a 2 to 1, by a margin of 2 to 1, Americans reject these views. But as we'll see, this minority that's about 3 in 10 Americans do have outsized influence and an outsized voice in the country, which is why I think we're hearing so much about this phenomenon today. The other thing we were able to do is to actually track this over the last year. And one of the things we found is that these have remained fairly stable across the last year. A little bit of up and down, but for the most part, we're finding no significant movement among these categories across the year. So what does this look like at the state level? You may look at this, and if I didn't tell you what it was, it would probably look fairly familiar to you. And that is, it looks a lot like the red state, blue state map, and that is correct. So this is the number of Americans in each state, the percentage of each Americans in each state who are Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers. So those 2 groups together, you can see that there are a number of states where it gets to as high as half, like in my home state of Mississippi, it's half of Mississippians that are either Christian nationalism supporters or adherents, and then it drops significantly down. For example, like in Massachusetts, it's only 18% who hold these views. As you can see, it's basically a U shape. It comes from the upper Midwest down into the deep Southeast and then up across the Appalachian mountains. And that is kind of the same kind of, you'll see that's the same pattern we typically see on the kind of red state, blue state political maps. And they are in fact highly correlated. So if we look at, for example, states that are considered to be, on that kind of red and blue, red is Republican, blue as Democrat, states that are fairly safe, red states, fairly safe, blue states, and then states that are considered battleground states, we do see how highly correlated this is. In fact, we see that red states are nearly twice as likely to be Christian adherents, Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers compared to residents of blue states, battleground states, somewhere in between. So it's nearly 4 in 10 of those who residents of red states qualify as either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. We see a similar thing if we look at a scatter plot of all states, and we look at it by, this is support for Christian nationalism on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and it is a percent vote for Donald Trump in 2020 on the y-axis. This is all Americans. It is down to the state level. One of the things we can do with this large data set, and you can see it's a pretty tight correlation. In other words, the kind of higher a state ranks in the average score on the Christian nationalism scale, the higher the likelihood that state voted for Trump. This is all Americans, and we'll see the work that sort of racial identity, and particularly white racial identity, does here. On the next slide, I'm going to kind of pop it over and show you what happens if we restrict the analysis to white Americans only, and you'll see this tighten up significantly. So here we go. Right, so states really do align much more tightly across this line. I'm going to go back real quick to give you an example. If you look at Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, they are the states that are below the line in the far bottom right hand of this distribution. These are also states that have significant numbers of African Americans there, and you'll see that once we restrict it to whites only, you'll see them jump up. So there they are below the line. And we restrict this to whites only, and you'll see the kind of distribution jump up, and they are now kind of all like right up either at or above the line in this above this trend line. And I'd say that this is a near textbook example of high correlation. If you were looking at you wanted a textbook and you wanted an example of very tight correlation around a trend line, this would fit perfectly well as an example. And again, you can see the role that white racial identity plays in tightening up this correlation between support for Christian nationalism and support for Donald Trump all the way down to the state level. So one of the things we're able to do is to go with a high degree of confidence, look at which groups are most likely to support Christian nationalism in the country. So this is back up to the national level. Here are the groups, kind of political groups, either party identification and holding favorable views of Trump. You can again see the high correlation between those how likely Republicans are to be adherents and sympathizers versus Democrats. So it's a majority of Republicans and a majority of those who hold favorable views of Trump. 55% of each of these groups are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, compared, for example, to only 16% of Democrats and 15% of those who hold a favorable view of Joe Biden. So highly structuring the partisan divides in the country. The other thing to say is that we also see significant patterns among religious groups. So again, I'm plotting here just the percent of each group that are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. One group here clearly stands out. It is white evangelical Protestants, 2/3 of whom qualify as either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. Behind them, and the only other religious group to register majority or more support for Christian nationalism are Latino Protestants. Again, 55% of Latino Protestants are Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. One thing to note there that Latino Protestants are overwhelmingly evangelical in their orientation, and most actually identify racially as white. So those two things actually are, I think, part of why they are scoring higher on this scale than other religious groups. Everyone else is 4 in 10 or below. The other thing to say is there's been some mythology out there that people who support Christian nationalism or support the MAGA movement are what is sometimes referred to as Christians in name only. That is, that they claim to be Christian but don't actually aren't connected to churches, don't go to church, aren't part of religious communities. We find no support really for that thesis. In fact, the opposite is true. So here are church attendance levels and the likelihood that people at each attendance level qualify as Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. You'll see that a majority of those who attend religious services weekly or more, 52%, qualify as religious adherents or sympathizers. And it's just linear. The less you go to church, the less likely you are to identify as a Christian nationalism adherent or sympathizers. And that includes this kind of middle category of even attending a few times a year. So I think this tells us that if we're going to study this phenomenon, we need to not look outside of churches, but we need to look inside of churches as what's really going on if we really want to understand this phenomenon. Two other things I want to point out here. The survey also had some measures of theology, and particular theology that has become prominent in more charismatic or Pentecostal circles. And we find, again, kind of high correlations between ideas of prophecy, ideas about healing and laying on of hands, and prosperity gospel, this idea that God rewards those who have faith with good health and financial success in the country. And so I'll give the breakdowns here. These are the percentages of Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers who agree with each of these theological statements. You see it's 8 and 10, just to take the first one, Christian nationalism adherents who believe that God reveals his plans for the future to humans as prophecy. And you can see, again, if I put up the skeptics and rejectors, what a clear and linear difference there is in belief in all three of these components. So these are playing a role, I think, in kind of understanding the worldview of Christian nationalism in the country. And also, that's kind of theology. There are also some insights that got political worldview. We have two statements here. One that is kind of resonant of the QAnon conspiracy theory. There's a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. It's also kind of a political revolutionary idea. And then another one that's specifically about political violence, that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. The numbers that are up right now are the number of all Americans who agree with those statements. It's a quarter or less who agree with either one of those statements. And then you'll see the impact or the correlation between belief in those statements and belief in Christian nationalism here. Again, I'll put up the adherents and sympathizers. It's a majority of adherents who hold this kind of political revolution idea, nearly half of sympathizers. And then over here on the support for political violence, it's nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents and a third of Christian nationalism sympathizers who believe true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. Views are much less strongly correlated among Christian nationalism skeptics and rejectors. So finally, I'll kind of wrap with some insights about some racial differences. So we did find that that there are not significant differences in terms of race, people identifying purely with these 5 measures of Christian nationalism. However, we have evidence they mean very different things in political space. And so that's kind of what I want to show here. We've broken out the results among white adherents and sympathizers, Hispanic adherents and sympathizers, and Black adherents and sympathizers. So you can see the differences here. So this is the party affiliation of white Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers. About 2/3 identify as Republican. You can see there's a much different portrait among Latino adherents and sympathizers. Only about 1/3, even of those who are Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers, identify as Republican. And you'll see a very big difference here among African American adherents or sympathizers. So in other words, even among African Americans who agree with those Christian nationalism sentiments, it does not kind of extend into political space and make them more likely to be Republican. In fact, there are no significant differences between Black Americans, between those who support Christian nationalism and those who don't, in terms of party affiliation. It really doesn't move the needle there. Similar thing here with Trump and Biden favorability. These are all Americans' favorable views of Trump and Biden. Here are white Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers. You can see this dramatic increase in support for Trump, more than 7 in 10. It's way more than twice as many compared to all Americans who said they hold favorable views of Trump. If we look among Latino adherents and sympathizers, you can see the influence here, but it's a bare majority with favorable views of Trump. And then we basically see the opposite thing among Black adherents, Christian nationalism adherents, sympathizers. It's 21%, which is a little higher than African Americans overall, but not a huge amount. But it's still overwhelmingly, in fact, Black Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers are 3 times as likely to hold a favorable view of Biden as they are to hold a favorable view of Trump. And finally, one thing we find here is that there is not a lot of connection among non-white Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers to far-right news sources. So here are each group by race: white Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers versus non-white Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers who say they most trust far-right news outlets. This is like One American News or Newsmax and Fox News on the one hand. And you can see the huge differences among white Christian nationalism adherents. It is about a third who say they most trust these outlets, and it's less than 1 in 10 among African-American Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers. Great. And there's the rest of it. So I'm going to close with just a couple of comments, and then I'm going to hand it over to Katherine here. But I do want to just say one kind of overall thing, that in previous writings I've made the case that Christian nationalism is really best understood as something that's not completely new, but it's a new term for the current incarnation, I think, of a fairly old phenomenon. And that is, it's basically this claim that America is a God-ordained promised land for European Christians. And it goes along with that, where they should occupy the highest positions of power, and where laws are judged to be valid based on their particular interpretation of the Bible. And it's fairly clear from this data that we've never fully resolved the contradictions between that claim of America as a Christian nation and the aspirational vision of America as a pluralistic democracy. I think the survey also illustrates how strongly Christian nationalism, particularly when it's refracted through the lens of whiteness, is driving support for Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and how thoroughly this has established itself as an ideological keystone in today's Republican Party. And I think it's clear to me, too, that until we really vanquish what can only be called like this dangerous anti-democratic political ideology, it'll continue to undermine the potential for a truly democratic American future. So let me turn it now over to Katherine.
Thank you so much, Robbie. I'm grateful to you and to PRRI for carrying out this important survey. It really gives us hard numbers around which to understand the political realities today. Christian nationalism is the single biggest component of the Trump MAGA movement. It's extremely tightly correlated to Trump votes and Biden disapproval. It's apocalyptic, tends toward violence, and is strongly linked with race and, frankly, racism. So it turns out being a white supporter of Christian nationalist ideas is far more a predictor of being a Trump MAGA supporter than being a Black supporter of some of those same ideas. The survey also draws attention to an important indicator, which is the growing number of Hispanic and Latino MAGA supporters. And the key here is that Hispanic and Latino supporters are particularly open to Christian nationalism on the Protestant side. Now, that's due in part to the fact that religious right leaders have made a substantial effort to draw pastors into pastoral networks. They've done this for years with white conservative-leaning pastors, and there's more recently been an effort to do the same with Hispanic and Latino pastors. These pastors are given tools and materials to spread messaging about Christian nationalism and biblical values through their churches. This data is also a useful research tool. I think it can help us understand the deep and structural origins of Christian nationalism. and this threat to our democracy. It helps us frame questions. It might not give us all of the answers, but it gives us a numerical scaffolding to help get other investigations started and structured. So I'll just give one example. In the PRRI survey, we see a score for every state according to adherents of Christian nationalism and sympathizers. So I'm not a statistician, but I did 2 quick and dirty investigations looking at state by state per capita income and life expectancy compared with the Christian nationalism index in this PRRI study. It's a simple analysis, and I think many of you will have a sense of what it's going to show. There are some deep structural trends at work here. The general trend, and there is some variation, but the general trend is that Christian nationalism is to some degree an expression or a consequence of some very serious social and economic dysfunction. There's plenty of other factors involved. And if you live in a state, depending on, the, economic situation of that state, but there are plenty of other, it's really important to see that if you live in a state where people tend to have lower incomes and die earlier, you're very likely to be surrounded by people who are either adherents or sympathizers with these views. So, again, I'm not a statistician. I encourage others to do more professional studies. But the point really is that this kind of study that PRRI has produced can help us put some numbers and some detailed analysis around the narrative and understanding that we have of this phenomenon. It's also important to remember that religious nationalism is more than just a set of attitudes. Like authoritarianism, it's a political dysfunction that afflicts political systems. And this data from PRRI helps us frame the facts here in America. We can also think of it this way. In other countries like Russia or Turkey or Hungary, leaders use religion to divide their populations into those who supposedly belong and those who supposedly don't. And they do this to be more authoritarian in the way that they govern. They do it to protect themselves from investigation into their own corruption and the abuses that they're carrying out against their own people. Some of those countries are theocratic in a certain fake sense. That is, they might endorse a particular state religion and seek to impose those values, typically patriarchal, homophobic values in their countries, but they're more accurately described as kleptocratic, cronyistic states with suppression of political opposition and free speech. So I do think it's helpful in understanding the way this movement works here in America to distinguish between the leaders and the followers. The foot soldiers of the movement may believe they're fighting for things like traditional marriage and a ban on abortion. But over time, the movement's leaders and strategists have consciously reframed these culture war issues in order to capture and control their votes. And they use it as a way to smuggle in regressive economic policies that satisfy the needs, the desires, I should say, not the needs, but the desires of the funders of the movement for low taxation for the rich, deregulation of extractive monopolies, and environmentally destructive policies. The movement is as strong as it is because it's invested for over 50 years in a sort of deeply interconnected organizational network, all these different organizations that are often interconnected. You have policy groups, legal groups, groups that focus on legislation or data or networking. There are, as I mentioned earlier, networks that engage clergy to get their congregations to vote a certain way. And those values are inevitably down to a handful of culture war issues. Then there's that vast far-right messaging sphere that plays a role in spreading conspiracism and disinformation. And that's where we see some of the data from PRRI, where you talk about, Americans been overtaken by a storm of elites or whatever the language is. It's really, frankly, dangerous. We have misunderstood the extent to which this movement is committed to undermining the democratic process. The thing that's at stake in the rise of religious nationalism in America is not merely whether we blur the line between church and state or offend the feelings of an outgroup. The thing that's at stake is the way our political system is organized. It's about rational governance. It's about the rule of law. It's about voting rights, the principles of equality. It's about pluralism. It's about true religious freedom, the future of public education, the legitimacy of the judiciary, and many other public institutions upon which our democracy depends. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Katherine. So Jemar, we're going to hand the baton to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. I want to focus on the Black Christian adherents and sympathizers to Christian nationalism. Isn't it interesting how we can use the same words but mean very different things? This is what's happening between Black Christians and white Christians when it comes to Christian nationalism. First, it's important to note that Black people as a demographic group are highly religious. And for the vast majority of Black people, the religion they adhere to is Christianity. According to a PRRI survey from 2022, religion plays an important role in the lives of Black Americans. More than 7 in 10 Black Americans, 71%, are Christians. And this represents a slight decrease from 2013 when it was at 79%, but that's still 7 in 10 people, Black people, who identify as Christian. So this gives some context for how Black Christians might agree with the 5 diagnostic questions used to assess adherence to Christian nationalism in this latest survey. A highly Christian demographic is likely to agree with statements such as U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, or if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not be a country anymore. But isn't it interesting how we can use the same words but mean very different things? When Black Christians engage in faith and politics, it traditionally leads to an expansion of civil rights and freedoms for all. When Christian nationalists who are white engage in faith and politics, it tends to lead to a narrowing of rights and a consolidation of power among a select few. That's because the ends or the purposes, the goals of each group are different. Black Christians tend to seek cultural influence and political rights, to be sure, but Christian nationalists who are white often are seeking political dominance, a vision of the nation and who controls it that is very narrow. People who have historically been marginalized and minoritized want to be part of the conversation, but not to dominate it, because they know how it feels to be on the receiving end of domination. So what accounts for the differences between Black Christian adherence to Christian nationalism and white Christian adherence to Christian nationalism? Well, of course, there are many factors, but I want to focus on one historical factor: the stark separation between white and Black churches. It's been said that 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. Now, this does not only mean that white Christians and Black Christians are in different congregations on Sunday. It means they're hearing different messages. We've seen from the data a strong correlation between higher church attendance and stronger adherence to Christian nationalism. And this means that churches are vectors of Christian nationalism, super spreaders of this anti-democratic ideology. Many of the messages linking Christian identity, American identity, and political dominance are coming from churches, and the constellation of related entities from the publishing world to voices of celebrities and prominent leaders and news outlets. Black Christians, on the other hand, receive very different messages about faith and politics. And Black Christians have always had to interpret Christianity in the context of their own oppression in the United States. I think Frederick Douglass put it eloquently when he said in his autobiography, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked." So from the hush arbors where enslaved people would sneak out into the woods after laboring all day to worship God in their own way, to the birth of the African Methodist Episcopal Church beginning in the late 1700s, Black Christians have always tended to interpret Christianity differently. And these differences accelerate, crystallize, and become institutionalized after the Civil War and post-emancipation. Black Christians began starting their own denominations, such as the National Baptist Convention, the Church of God in Christ, and more. These congregations and denominations had much to say about faith and politics, but to very different ends than white Christians. They taught about gaining rights as people worthy of equal status and dignity to white people. They taught about having the spiritual strength to withstand the political disfranchisement brought on by racism. And it's important to note that to this day, most Black Christians attend Black churches. A Pew Research study noted that overall 60% of Black churchgoers attend Black churches where all or most attendees are Black and the senior religious leaders are Black. It's also important to note 13% attend a church that's predominantly white, and 25% of Black Christians attend a multiracial church where no single race makes up a majority of attendees. And these results are showing up in the findings like this report, where strong adherence to Christian nationalist beliefs does not correlate to things like Republican Party affiliation, nor do Black adherents to Christian nationalist beliefs tend to reprioritize political issues. So where white Christian nationalists say that unfettered gun rights and strict control on immigration are some of the most important issues, Black people tend to point to other issues. Again, from the 2022 PRRI poll, for Black voters overall, the issues that most guided their votes included increasing costs of housing and everyday expenses, 64%, racial inequality, 62%, crime, 57%, abortion, 57%, and the health of the country's democracy at 55%. It's a very different set of issues. And so this is why I continue to insist that we keep the white in white Christian nationalism. This is for at least two reasons. First, white Christian nationalists have a very specific view of how society should be arranged. Whether implied or stated, they envision a world where white people are in control, especially wealthy white men. All others are in some sort of subordinate role, and this includes Black people and other people of color. In this sense, and I don't want to draw too solid a line in terms of comparison, but I do think it bears mentioning that this social arrangement is not dissimilar from a plantation hierarchy. The white wealthy male patriarch in charge of his white wife and white children, then the enslaved people on his plantation as an extension of his family, but as perpetual children and never as equals. The second reason we must refer to this as white Christian nationalism is for the very reasons this report highlights. The ways that white Christians and Black Christians interpret Christian nationalist statements differs sharply in their political dimensions. Their Black Christian nationalist adherents are not significantly more likely to be Republican or to prioritize issues such as gun control and immigration. So, to resist the spread of white Christian nationalism, it's important that we take a couple of actions. First of all, Christians must undertake to refute Christian nationalism in their churches, which serve as sites to spread this ideology. And second, we should look at the Black Christian tradition for an alternative and more democratic way of engaging faith in politics. I've said it before, and this latest data reinforces it. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamar. Really appreciate that. And Andrew, off to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Robbie. And yeah, thankful for this time to be with you all. And as a kindergartner, I was always sad when I was a W and at the end, and following Katherine and Jamar with the wonderful comments they had to say today, again, is a tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my best. and really come at it from my position as a social scientist that's been looking at Christian nationalism and studying it for about a decade now, and really excited to see PRRI and the good folks there really aiming some of the work that they do at this to really help us understand and gather data that to this point we just have not had. The American Values Atlas and a survey with this many people over this period of time is really such an important development as we look at all this. And so I'd like to highlight just a couple things that stood out to me, but so much of what's been shared already has done that. But I think what I would like to do as well is to highlight how much this work fits within what we've been seeing for the last decade as we continue to discover more and refine our techniques. I think this is such a key development in showing that where we were and where we've been going, this is an important point to say that we were on the right track. And this is saying a lot of the things that we thought that could be going on, but now we can really look in a more fine-grained manner. And I think too, with the map that we can now see at the state level where Christian nationalism is, and to chart it by state and to look at how some of those things correlate with other things happening, whether it's vote choice, as we start to look, and Katherine raised this, at economic issues or healthcare issues, and various things like that. It's really key. And as we look forward to 2024, as we are now essentially ramping up to another election, this is going to be key, especially in battleground states. Because while we look at this and we see that really with the way that our electoral process is structured, there really are just a number of states that truly matter in the outcome of an election. And this, while Christian nationalism is not the only story, and I wouldn't say that ever, it is a key part of it. And so understanding and seeing where folks who align with that are adherents or sympathizers with Christian nationalism, because of how strongly it is correlated with voting for the Republican candidate, usually is really notable and is going to be key to keep in mind. And two, another aspect that I think is so important is getting understanding of the relative size of this group of Americans who either are adherents to or sympathizers with Christian nationalism. And what's so wonderful about this survey, given its size and the length of time where data was collected, we can see, and PRRI shares in their report, over time, what those sizes of different groups look like. And we see relative stability over the last year or two, based on a prior research report that they released. And so we can see too that, again, 3 in 10 Americans are at least sympathetic with that. And that is notable, especially again, as we look at where Christian nationalism is, as we look at where those battleground states are. And recognizing that in 2016, Donald Trump won the election essentially due to 80,000 people over 3 different states. And so because of the way our election's structured, I think, again, it's key to know where these folks are and what that looks like within the states. So that is a key point, and I think will be really useful for journalists, educators, those that are working on the ground across the US, to be able to see what is taking place and where. But what I would like to then highlight is that this PRRI report, alongside their 2023 report, which I would strongly recommend, you can find on their website, and reports and research that have been done by others over the last 5 years and even reaching back 10 years, is that much of what we find really does show a consistency in what Christian nationalism is and what it's associated with. So just looking at this newest research report, and again, I would point you to PRRI's former report that came out in early 2023. We see Christian nationalism continues to be strongly associated with support for Donald Trump, white evangelical Protestantism, a comfort with authoritarian social control and a desire for a strongman to take control, a comfort and even support for political violence in order to bring the country back on track, devotion to the Second Amendment, a desire to limit or even end immigration or to turn away refugees, opposition to LGBTQ civil rights, opposition to abortion for almost any reason. And as we look at these various factors, we see that this aligns with work that I've been a part of, in a book that came out in 2020 and papers that were in the middle 2010s. And so what does this consistency mean to me? Well, to me, what this report does, and I think it's such a clear addition into what we're finding overall, is that there is a clear and empirically supported definition and understanding of what Christian nationalism is. And I think Jemar's comments are so key in that is a white Christian nationalism, as I'll explain in a second, but not only what it is, but the implications of it for American civic life. Because one of the things that I tend to hear over and over, and I'm sure those that are on this webinar hear this too, is, oh, we don't really know what Christian nationalism is, or it's not clearly defined, or it's not clearly measured. But we can see that with PRRI's work and the work of others, as they align over and over, and maybe sizes change slightly, but we see over and over, no matter how we measure it with slight changes to wording of questions, it is strongly associated with so much of the same things. And so we can know that Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism is indeed a cultural framework. So it is a collection of myths and traditions, symbols and narratives and value systems that idealize and advocate for a fusion of a very particular expression of Christianity. And again, I would point to Jemar and Katherine's remarks of Christianity with American civic life. So it holds that this particular version of Christianity really should be the principal and undisputed cultural framework in the United States, with the hope that the government at various levels would vigorously preserve this particular cultural framework. And so while this particular expression of Christianity that's referenced in Christian nationalism, and we can draw this out by looking again at how it operates differently for white and Black Americans in particular. But while it refers to theological and orthodox beliefs, it includes these other elements, these other cultural elements that really do underscore the threat that it poses to a pluralistic democratic society. So first, the first element is that it has a desire for society organized according to traditionalist social arrangements. So our ideal society is one where men lead and women support, marriage is ideally heterosexual, and families have a mom and a dad that are committed to procreation. So American citizens and families that represent these particular ideals will have the easiest access to civil rights and liberties. But those families or people that do not embrace these ideals will be denied access, or at least easy access. Alongside this desire for traditionalist social arrangements is a comfort with authoritarian social control. And PRRI surveys and others show this consistently, that for Americans that embrace Christian nationalism, they view the world as a chaotic place, and that they want strong leaders who, through the threat of violence or actual violence, will defend those preferred social arrangements and hierarchies. Now, alongside traditionalist social arrangements, comfort with authoritarian social control, Christian nationalism, another element, is a desire for strong ethno-racial boundaries around national identity, around civic participation and social belonging, who gets to call themselves a true American. And with this element, we see, and it aligns with what Dr. Tisby was sharing. The ideal American within this framework is generally understood to be a natural-born Anglo-Protestant person. So they view this group as the one that created the United States, and it's this group that should remain central to the cultural identity and political leadership operating within the US. And finally, with Christian nationalism, another element is a populist impulse. And this populist impulse creates space for Americans that embrace it to embrace feelings of victimization, to believe that elites are trying to persecute them, which lends itself to adopting more conspiratorial thinking, to think that white Christians in America are being silenced or persecuted. And we even hear this narrative from those that have risen to some of the top levels of government, namely the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. So I think what's important with this report and what's so wonderful about it, and the fact that PRRI has gathered this data, is that we can know what Christian nationalism is. We can define it clearly, and it's an empirically supported definition that we see consistently over survey after survey. So as we look at this report, and as we see recent headlines with reporting in Politico, or we look at Donald Trump's speech to the religious broadcasters a week or so ago, is that Christian nationalism is going to be a central aspect of the lead up to the 2024 election. And this should encourage us. And really, I feel as though any American that is committed to a pluralist democratic society should be committed to learning more and understanding what this means for them in their communities. For anybody that has a desire to see an America where all people, regardless of race, religion, or creed, are given the opportunity to flourish. And so I want to again thank PRRI and Robert Jones for the work that they do. It is incredibly important to continue to keep our eyes on this and the work that they're doing for all of us. And so, yeah, thank you for this opportunity to share.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Why don't you all join me back on camera here? We'll open it up for some conversation. I'm just going to throw out one question that Andrew, you helpfully set the table for very well by mentioning some recent events. So I'm also cognizant here. We have like a journalist, a historian, a religious studies person, and a sociologist on here on the call. So we've all got slightly different lenses, and so we all have kind of our academic interests, but I think we're also all paying attention, right, to just kind of what's going on. And I'd love to just ask this, like, so we talked about the data, we talked about identifying how to think about it, how to talk about it, how to analyze it. What does it look like on the ground? So like, what's hit your radar screens as you're like, oh, like there it is, when you kind of hear this. So no particular order, but like what comes to mind of that clear, like a crystal clear example of like what this looks like on the ground?
I'll start, if that's all right, with something we've all seen in the news, the attack on IVF. It really shows, look, a lot of the messaging that takes place in sort of churches that are spreading the ideas of Christian nationalism center on abortion. It's a binary issue. You're either for killing babies, you're against killing babies, the way they show it, and they just sort of make it be the issue of their time and the issue that they want people to vote around. But the attack on IVF, which is a logical consequence of the way that they describe, the idea that life begins at the moment of conception, it shows that they're really not going to stop at abortion. It's just one piece of a much larger pie of going after people's rights. I think it should obliterate the illusion that they're going to stop with X number of week bans or make compromises. They're really going to go after control of everything connected with sex and reproduction, including some of the most popular and effective forms of birth control, which by the same logic that they used in Alabama, the Alabama Supreme Court Judge Tom Parker used to say, this is unbiblical, this is, we can't have this. That same logic would ban the most popular and also effective forms of birth control pills, certain forms of IUD and things like that. And we've also seen state laws that are going after the ability of women who are pregnant to travel, to the ability of police officers to counsel rape victims, the ability of doctors to, counsel their patients, and so many other rights. So it's this idea of state control is the normalization of the idea of state control and the use of religious nationalism to take away people's rights and frankly, their freedom of speech and freedom of movement is something that we should all be cognizant of.
I was struck by I actually read the opinion, the concurring opinion by Tom Parker, because I was so flabbergasted by it. And he quotes the King James Bible. He quotes Christian theologians, and then just declares that the people of Alabama have adopted a theological conception of the person, right? And what he means by that is a white evangelical, a particular white evangelical conception of the person. And then that same day appears on a podcast affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation and the Seven Mountains Mandate. In fact, the podcast is called Restore 7 that he appeared on, right? And talked about his role in it and executing dominion over the justice, over the courts and the Justice Department. Yeah. Anything else? What else comes to mind? Jamar, Andrew?
Speaking from the church perspective, as Christian nationalism has gained attention, notoriety, ascendancy in many congregations, I think especially since 2015, 2016, and that presidential election, there's been a sifting in the church, where a lot of people who are resistors or skeptics of Christian nationalism have decided they can no longer stay in those congregations. It will be interesting to research where they end up. Do they become the nuns? Do they find other more liberal or progressive congregations or denominations to land in? But it seems to be a sort of hardening of the sides, where at this point in 2024, if churches are still preaching and teaching Christian nationalism, that's what they're about. That's what they're committed to by and large. And the churches that aren't are against it. And so I think we've seen some splitting, some shifting in that sense. I think as well, we're seeing the importance of other Christians practicing Christianity, particularly racial and ethnic minority communities or other people who have been marginalized or minoritized in various ways. The ways they're approaching religion and politics is quite different. I mean, we can think, for example, of a Raphael Warnock, who literally occupies the pulpit that Martin Luther King Jr. did and is also a senator, and his politics differ sharply from white Christian adherence to Christian nationalism. So it is having an effect in the churches, yet and still these beliefs are spreading in and throughout churches and the related networks. And so that has to be part of the conversation as we think about how to address white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I'll just, real quickly touch on this, Robert. I think it's an important point. And I think right now, as we lead up to the 2024 election, and again, the gift that PRRI gives us with understanding state level differences and adherents or sympathizers is to look at those states that are either trying to further restrictions on voting or trying to support access to the vote. And I would hazard a guess that if we looked at those states that are trying to place further restrictions on ease of voting, it's going to overlay pretty well. But again, that's the stuff that we can start to do. That's what we can start to see to have a more fine-grained analysis. Because what we see in our overall surveys, as you all probably know, is that Americans that embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to believe that we need to restrict the vote, that voting is not a right, but it's only a privilege, and privileges can be taken away, and only certain Americans should have access to it. But they have a very particular vision of the right Americans that should be participating. And so in their minds, that's not ending democracy, but democracy is for those that should be allowed to participate. And so I think that's where the logic is, and that's where this data helps us make that connection. And then really quickly with Jamar's point, I agree. And there's just one story I heard recently I was meeting with a pastor, and he was, starting to read a bit about this and kind of had a flashback to a moment recently in his church where, as they were discussing this topic, having somebody come up and poking him in the chest and yelling at him, and the fact that he's trying to talk about this, and him feeling for the first time in his life physically threatened, but it's in a church from somebody that consistently sits in the pews. And so, to Jamar's point, there's a real life, real world implication for this work, and we can look at it in the broad scale, but it has a real effect on real lives down to down into the communities that we're in. And so the importance, I think, really can't be overstated.
Oh, thanks for that. Well, we are almost at time here. The one thing I think I'll add just from my standpoint, and maybe we'll kind of take us home here, is, I often get the question, like, why now? Like, why are we seeing this, bubble up now? And I think, the straightforward answer is demographic change. That we are seeing actually, a pretty steady decline over the last few decades of white Christians in the country. In fact, we've moved from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. And so, to your point, all of your points about this idea of it's about dominion, control, ownership of who owns the country, who's the country for, who's a real American, like all these things that all of you have held up, I think are really what's at stake. And so there is a kind of backlash movement. And the reason why it has an apocalyptic feel, I think, and a kind of desperate feel that leads to the abandonment of traditional norms and the embrace of even extrajudicial things and things like aggressive, kind of physical confrontations and even violence, is because there is a kind of desperation here about the changes in the country and who's in charge and who's the country for. So, I think we're kind of down to these kind of basic questions. All of you have highlighted, is America a kind of promised land for European Christians, right? Where everybody else is second class, as you said, Jamar, or are we a pluralistic democracy, where Christianity and other religions each have their role to play, but none dominate, right, the political sphere? I mean, and I think we've kicked that can down the road, right, throughout all of our history, and it's still with us today. And that's really what we're facing today. So thank you so much, Katherine, Jamar, Andrew, for your time. You can all find the full report on the PRRI website at prri.org. Hope you will go find it there. You can also sign up for our newsletter there and get data like this in your inbox on a regular basis. So thank you all, and we'll talk soon.